Hi there, folks. My name is Elliot Kimmel, and I am a high school teacher at Central Secondary School in London, Ontario, Canada. And this is my blood vessels video tutorial recommended for students in grade 11 biology studying the circulatory system. The images in this video tutorial are mostly taken from the internet. They're not my photographs or images, although I have created a few of them. You'll also see reference to worksheets which are available on my website at www.zerobio.com, and I'll refer to those periodically as well. The instructions for viewing this, students will need to get together some note paper to take notes, something to write with such as a pen, and like I mentioned, some blood vessel printouts that you'll need throughout the video. If you're not a student of mine or you don't have access to those printouts, you can still gain something by watching this, I hope. While you're viewing the video tutorial, students will need to draw some diagrams and take notes. I'll make mention of that periodically, and you'll need to pause the video so you have enough time to do this. So if you're a teacher showing this to your students, could you please pause the video once in a while and give them time to finish taking a note before moving on. After you view the video tutorial, you'll be asked to complete a worksheet, which is part of the printouts from my website. Okay, so let's have a look at the blood vessel pathway. Let's start with the heart over here. Imagine that the heart pumps the blood. We're going to be looking at oxygenated blood, so assume that it's already got O2, oxygen in it, which needs to be delivered to the tissues. So the blood will go from the heart into large diameter blood vessels, which are arteries. Arteries are like major highways, let's say. For example, here in Ontario, we've got Highway 401. So imagine the artery is like a major highway carrying the cars or the oxygen to large city streets, which would be representative of things like arterioles. So an artery is a large diameter tube which narrows down into smaller diameter tubes or smaller diameter arteries, which are called arterioles. The arterioles then branch off and carry that oxygenated blood down to the tissues, which receive that blood through capillaries. So capillaries are the smallest of the blood vessels. They are the site of gas and nutrient exchange, and I'll talk about that a little bit later when we look at the structure of a capillary. But remember, it's just the smallest blood vessel. All right, and this is where the nutrients and gases are exchanged. And at this point, oxygen goes from the capillary to the tissue cells, and carbon dioxide comes from the tissue cells into the capillary, and that will then carry that carbon dioxide and any other wastes back towards the heart or wherever it needs to be expelled from. So capillaries, the smallest blood vessels, then widen out as they go back towards the heart in structures called venules. So a venule is a small diameter vein, and again, you can think of these as large streets in your city. So a capillary would be like a neighborhood street, the street that you live on with your house. All right, sort of a small street, and then the small streets gather at the major streets in the city. That could be a venule, back to a vein, and then back to the heart. So another highway back to the heart. Okay, so this is a continuous closed cycle of blood vessels. Now let's have a look at the specific blood vessels, and let's talk about the arteries. So sorry, before I forget, I do want to ask you to draw this blood vessel pathway in your notes. Now, we're going to talk about the artery, and there will be a diagram that will show up over here and some notes, and you're going to want to write this stuff down as well. So let's start by drawing a couple of circles here. We're going to draw this white area represents something called the lumen, and you've seen that when we've talked about the digestive system before. The lumen is the cavity or the opening inside of an organ or a blood vessel. If this was the circular cross-section of the esophagus, you recall there is a lumen that the food would travel down. In this case, the lumen is the blood flow channel, and the first real layer of a blood vessel, in this case an artery, is called the tunica intima. Think of it as a tunic, which is a wraparound piece of clothing that wraps around, and intima implies that it's intimate or very close to the lumen. It's proximal to the lumen. This would be analogous to the mucosa of the esophagus or the stomach. The next layer moving more distal to the lumen, so moving outwards of an artery, is called the tunica media. Now there are 3 layers, so this is going to be the middle layer, so it's called media. And the 3rd layer is called the tunica externa. It's the most external of the 3 layers: tunica intima, tunica media, tunica externa. It's also called the tunica adventitia, and this is the layer that will eventually just sort of meld or mesh into surrounding tissue and muscle, and I'll show you some pictures of that. So there are 3 major layers in a blood vessel, such as an artery: the tunica intima, closest to the lumen, the tunica media, which is the middle layer, and then the tunica externa. Now the tunica media has muscle. There's circular muscle, and you may recall when we looked at the muscularis of the esophagus or the intestine, there was circular muscle that when that circular muscle contracts, that would narrow the diameter of the artery, and when the muscle relaxes, it would expand the diameter. All right, so let's talk about that a bit on the side. So go ahead and write these points down. There are 3 major layers to the artery. The lumen is in the center, and this is the blood flow channel. There is a thick tunica media that contains muscle, and this is going to differentiate an artery from a vein, the fact that there's a thick tunica media in an artery. In a vein, there's a much thinner tunica media. Arteries are roughly circular in shape, and that's due in part to the thick tunica media. A big thick muscle ring here that gives the artery a circular shape. Arteries carry oxygenated blood away from the heart, as we saw in that first pathway diagram. And in medical illustrations, in textbooks and stuff, arteries are colored red. Now, that's not an important fact of arteries and their structure or function. It's just something to note when you look through medical diagrams. Here is a photograph of a real artery with slightly different labeling. Now, this is the lumen here, L, and this is where the blood would be, all right? In fact, there are actually blood cells in this artery. Now, you'll notice a squiggly line here, sort of like a spring or something like that, that goes around. All right, so I'm going to talk about that. This is called the internal elastic membrane. So you're not going to draw this diagram, right? You've got your sketch of the artery here. I mean, you're welcome to, of course, but there's lots of images like this on the internet, and this is just one that I found here that I liked. But this is all part of the tunica intima. See, you can see TI there, and it's a rather thin layer. I've drawn it in my previous diagram a little bit thicker so that you could see it. Surrounding the tunica intima, then, is this layer here, which is, you know, roughly this area here. That's the tunica media. That's what TM stands for. And, you know, if you look carefully at this, perhaps you can sort of get the sense that there's circular muscle going around. So this is the muscle of an artery that can contract to narrow the size of the lumen. That can affect the pumping of blood because arteries can actually squeeze and pump blood in addition to the heart. So note the circular muscle in the tunica media. Now, you've already written about that. I've added the word circular muscle. And because of that muscle layer, arteries can contract to push blood, and that's in addition to the push that is created by the heart. So, of course, the heart beats and pumps the blood. But imagine, you know, as that blood travels through, you know, a lot of arteries and stuff, it might slow down, whatever. Arteries can contract and force the blood even further. The tunica externa in this artery is also called the tunica adventitia, and that's out here in this region. And it's a rather nondescript layer. It just blends into the surrounding, you know, connective tissue and stuff like that. But there are the 3 major layers: tunica intima, tunica media, and tunica externa or adventitia. All right, now let's have a look at veins. Now, you're going to draw this diagram. Okay, so write down the word vein and draw the diagram. I'm not drawing this circular now, all right? I purposely tried to draw this in a different shape. So a vein has a lumen, just as an artery does, and it doesn't matter how big you draw this at this point. Don't think that arteries are bigger than veins or vice versa. There are large arteries like the aorta, and there are very large veins like the superior vena cava, but there are small arteries and small veins as well. So the size is not important. But veins also have a lumen. That's where the blood is. They've got a tunica intima, and then the next layer they have is a tunica media. I have actually drawn this thinner than I did in the artery, so it'd be a good idea if you could do that as well. The third layer is called the tunica externa or tunica adventitia. All right, so there are the same three layers in an artery and in a vein, but there are some differences. One of them I've already mentioned, the fact that the tunica media is thinner in a vein. All right, so once again, writing some notes about veins, there are three major layers: tunica intima, tunica media, tunica externa. There is, again, a lumen in the center. That's the blood flow channel. But as I've said, the tunica media is thinner, and this is because there is little to no muscle in this area here. So veins do not typically squeeze or contract on their own due to muscle in order to push blood, and we'll talk about that in a bit. Veins also have an irregular shape, and this is why I didn't draw this circular. I drew it sort of looks like a lake or a pond, top-down view or something. All right, so they're not circular like arteries, and that is because of the thinner tunica media, because they don't have a lot of muscle. They don't keep their shape. Veins carry deoxygenated blood back towards the heart. Arteries, oxy blood away. All right, and you can remember, artery has an A, so artery carries blood away. Veins, V comes later in the alphabet, and so it is T for towards. A couple of ways to remember these things. All right, veins are also colored blue in medical illustrations. So red arteries, blue veins, and some various differences between them. In this photograph, you can see up here, this is an artery. This is the lumen of the artery, and this layer in particular is the most prominent. That's going to be the tunica media, right? The tunica interna or intima, tunica media, and then the tunica externa, all this stuff here. But this is an artery, this is a vein. So notice the irregular shape of the vein and how thin the walls of the vein are, all right? So that's what I meant when I was talking about the irregular shape. And also I want to mention that, notice that you could say that this vein is larger than this artery. All right, so once again, don't think that arteries are more important or they're larger. They're thicker, but you know, they're not necessarily larger. Okay, so I just made a couple of points down here. Just note the irregular shape of the vein compared to the artery. You've already written about that, so it's not necessary to write that down. And again, notice the thinner tunica media, in the vein. So veins cannot contract to push the blood like arteries can. Now, instead of that, veins have muscles that surround them, and surrounding muscles are going to squeeze on the vein, and we're going to talk about that in just a second. And again, veins are not always smaller than arteries. Now, this is what I was referring to a moment ago. If you can try to make a quick or a rough sketch of that, that would be helpful. What you're looking at here is a cylindrical blood vessel going upwards like this, and they've cut it so that you can see from a side view what's going on, and there are these little things that are sticking up. These are valves, all right? And you can see in this position, the valve here, this side and this side have clicked together. And if you know anything about the heart and valves in the heart, you may have seen this concept before. What happens is, in order for blood to come back to the heart in a vein, if you consider that the heart pumped, the blood traveled through arteries, and then arterioles, and then capillaries, and delivered oxygen and nutrients, and then it came back into venules, and it's got to go all the way back to the heart in the veins after that long journey. Veins are not thick enough with enough muscle to squeeze and push the blood back. Like, imagine this is in your leg down here. How is the blood going to get all the way back up to the heart If when the heart pumps, it goes all the way through the arteries and arterioles and the capillaries and all that kind of stuff, and it's finally in a vein, and it's got to get back, but the vein doesn't have muscle to push it. And by this time, the pumping of the heart, the pressure and the force is pretty much gone by the time you get to here. So the way that it works is there are muscles on the sides of veins. Imagine this is in your leg, and I've got another illustration to show you this, but there are muscles here on the side, and when these muscles squeeze, they push on the vein, all right? They squeeze the vein, maybe a bit more like that, from both sides, and that pushes the blood upwards. But when those muscles relax, what's to stop the blood from just falling back downwards? Well, because these walls are so thin, the muscle is able to squeeze the vein, all right, pushing the blood up. And when that muscle relaxes and the blood starts to come back down, it pushes on this valve and causes it to close. That prevents the blood from going any further down. And then muscles that are up here in this location will squeeze, pushing the blood up. And these valves don't exist just once. They're every couple millimeters. There's some more valves. So when the muscles relax, the blood comes down, the valves close, pushing the blood up. Then there's valves right there. So the consistent sort of squeezing of various muscles is what returns blood to the heart. And these valves are what keep the blood flowing in that direction. So another difference between arteries and veins. Veins have things called valves, which are flaps of muscular tissue. The valves help blood travel in one direction, back to the heart, so that the blood doesn't come back down to where it was. It keeps it going up to the heart. The muscles around the vein contract, and that pushes the blood upwards. And you'll see that in my next illustration. When the muscle relaxes, the valves prevent the blood from falling back down, right? The valves close. Now, there is a disorder which is called varicose veins, which tends to develop as people age and with various blood pressure ailments, like if your blood pressure is too high and there's a lot of pressure all the time. These flaps of tissue get worn out and they kind of sag like that, and then the blood is able to come back down and the blood pools. And then the veins, because they're thin-walled, you got a lot of blood in here, the veins bulge out, and you can see this in the skin, and this is called varicose veins. All right, so have a look at this illustration. We've got some muscles on the side of a vein. You can see the valves here. So when the muscle squeezes, the blood is pushed up. So you can see the valve is open, the blood is going towards the heart. When the muscles relax and the blood starts to fall back down due to gravity, the valves click shut and the blood can't get any further. All right, so that's how those things work. So once again, veins have thinner walls than arteries, and that's what allows these muscles to squeeze on the veins. If you tried to squeeze on an artery with a big, thick tunica media, you really can't squish it very well with a muscle. It's the contraction then of surrounding muscles that squeeze the vein and push the blood back up. All right, let's talk now about capillaries. I'm avoiding any specific discussion about arterioles, small diameter arteries, or venules, small diameter veins, because they essentially have the same structure as an artery or a vein. Arteriole versus venule, right? Same structures, but they're just smaller in diameter. But a capillary is different. So write down the heading capillary, and then let's do a diagram here on the left, and let's do a few notes here on the right. So that's all you need to draw for the moment for a capillary, because a capillary is so small and so thin that all it has is one layer of surrounding tissue, and this is called the tunica intima. It, of course, has a blood flow channel, although it's very small, extremely tiny, but I didn't want to draw it so small. I wanted you to be able to see it, all right? That's all that the capillary has. But I'm going to draw some tissue cells around the capillary, because it's the capillary that really gets to the cellular level carrying nutrients. So imagine that you've got oxygen in the lumen here, right? The heart pumped, went through arteries, arterioles, all the way down to capillaries, and now you want to provide these cells with oxygen. The oxygen then just diffuses through the very thin tunica intima, and it goes to the tissue cells. And those cells will then use the oxygen for cellular respiration. Other nutrients or hormones or glucose or amino acids or things cells need can also go through the wall of the capillary. That's why we say the capillary is the site of gas and nutrient exchange. The nutrients will not diffuse through an artery wall or a vein wall. It's through the capillary because it's so thin. Carbon dioxide is produced by the tissues as a result of cell respiration. CO2 will then diffuse into the lumen of the capillary and then be transported through venules and veins back to the heart and to the lungs and stuff like that. So a capillary has just one layer, the tunica intima. It is the smallest and thinnest blood vessel. And this is where gases and nutrients diffuse across the tunica intima to the tissue cells or from the tissue cells. Let's have a look at the villus. Now, you don't have to draw this unless you want to. You should have already seen this in the digestive system, but this is one of the finger-like projections, right? An extension of the mucosa in the small intestine. This is a villus. And the function of this structure is to absorb nutrients that are already digested and broken apart that are in the lumen of the intestine. And these are going to be absorbed into the villus. So let's have a look at the blood supply. I mentioned that arteries are colored in red. Well, arterioles can also be colored in red. Veins and venules in blue. So the blood is going to be coming into this villus here, and it needs to pick up nutrients. So this is going to be an arteriole. The blood will then travel up here, and it gets to smaller and smaller branches. These are the capillaries, or because it's a bunch of capillaries all here, it's called a capillary network, all right? And so the arterial blood will come in here. It's now a capillary, and this is where nutrients like glucose and amino acids and stuff like that will go into the capillaries because they're so thin, and then the blood will come down here and exit by a venule. So enter by an arteriole into capillaries, exit by venule. What we've left off would be larger diameter arteries, that's supposed to be an A, and larger diameter veins, which would be downstream or upstream from these blood vessels. So there's an example of how the blood supply works in a villus. The arteriole carries blood in. Again, you've already studied this in the digestive system. It's not critical for you to write this unless you really want to have complete notes. It's never a bad idea to repeat this kind of stuff. The capillary network inside the villus absorbs the nutrients, and then the venule carries the blood out of the villus. Now, this gets into the printouts that you should have from my website, www.zerobio.com. This one is called Blood Vessel Diagrams, and I believe it's a PDF. This is just a cropped image of it. And here, once again, you will now have your own printout of a photograph of an artery and a vein. So notice the labels. We've got the lumen. There are some blood cells already in this artery and in this vein. So that's what this stuff is. But you've got the lumen. You've got the tunica intima, which is present here in the artery and here in the vein. It's a little hard to see where it is exactly, but it's the thinnest little line on the inside. The tunica media, nice and thick. Notice there's a line drawn here, nice and thick in an artery, thinner in a vein, and then the tunica externa, just a region outside here, present in both the artery and the vein. So again, the same three layers, but notice thicker tunica media, round shape versus irregular, all right? And once again, notice this vein is a rather large vein. It's not smaller than an artery, okay? So you have this diagram already. Below that diagram, you'll have this diagram and this table. So we're going to go through that part now. Now, I realize that this diagram is a little bit difficult to see here in this presentation and probably on your printout. There are a number of them out there, but hopefully you can get something out of this anyhow. These are just some of the major arteries of the body, and there are many other arteries. And of course, there's a series of veins which complement these or run parallel to them. And you can kind of think, if you like, use the highway analogy again. You know, when you're on the highway and some cars are heading east, and then you have cars on the other side of the road that are heading west. Just imagine sort of parallel or anti-parallel blood vessels like that. Arteries carrying blood in one direction, veins right beside it, often carrying blood in the other direction. All right, so let's go through and try to identify this. Number one, so what I'm going to ask you to do is on your printout to write the names right in this spot that I'm going to give you now. Number one is the pulmonary artery. It's coming out of the heart and it's carrying blood away, and this is going to carry blood to the lungs to pick up oxygen. This is one of the exceptions when it comes to blood vessels. A pulmonary artery is unlike other arteries in that although it's going away from the heart, it's carrying deoxy blood, not oxy blood, because it's going to go to the lungs to pick up oxygen. So that's part of the pulmonary artery there. The large artery in the body coming out of the left ventricle here, coming up and carrying blood around and up to this area, and then in behind is the aorta, and they don't even call it artery. It's such an important blood vessel. Now, this is going to be a little bit difficult to see, but there's a spot here where the aorta comes up and arches. Before this blood vessel branches and goes up here, and before it goes down here, there's a common trunk right here before it splits, like a main highway splitting into smaller ones. The area in number 3, before it splits, is called the brachiocephalic artery. And it's called this because brachio refers to arm, and you're going to see the brachial artery down here. So this is giving you a hint saying, I'm going to become the brachial artery, and the word cephalic refers to head region. So it's saying, I'm going to go into the arm, and I'm going to go into the head. All right, so that's called the brachiocephalic artery. And then the blood vessel that does go up into the head, here, number 4, that is the carotid artery. And the blood vessel that's going to go into the arm, before it gets to the arm, it has to travel through the shoulder region. Now, you have a bone in your neck and sort of shoulder area, which is called the clavicle, all right? And this blood vessel is below the clavicle bone, which you can't see in this diagram, but trust me, it's there, all right? So this is called the subclavian artery, and it's carrying blood into the shoulder. Then that blood vessel is going to continue down, and then it's going to form this thing I mentioned called the brachial artery. So the brachial artery is all down here. It's carrying blood from the shoulder down into the arm, and it's going to continue here. So number 7 is a continuation of the brachial artery, and there are various branches coming off, but we're not getting into any of that stuff right now. And then around the elbow region, the brachial artery is going to split into 2 major arteries. Now, one is on the side of your thumb, and that is going to be blood vessel number 8, and this is called the radial artery. And this is the artery that you feel when you take your pulse at your wrist. If you push and take your pulse, do you notice that when you take your pulse, if you know how to do this, you push sort of towards the outside, towards the thumb side. So if you were taking your pulse, you'd put your fingers somewhere around there. You don't put your fingers there. Now, you can feel your pulse at many locations. Obviously, you can feel it there and in your neck. But, you know, when you take the wrist pulse, you are actually feeling the blood vessel. There's the radial artery. You're looking right into it. There's the lumen, right? When the blood pumps, the artery swells to a larger size, like that kind of. All right, and you actually feel that distension, that stretch in the blood vessel as the blood pulses through because you're pushing on it. Anyhow, that's the radial artery. This artery here, branching off, is the ulnar artery, and these also refer to the bones. There's the radius and the ulna in this region of the body as well. All right, so let's go back up here. Number 10 is pointing to a part of the aorta that has curved under the heart and is traveling down through the thorax. That's the thorax region, and going to go down into the abdomen. So, I mean, there's a couple of different names for it in different spots. I'm just calling it the descending aorta because it's carrying blood downwards in this direction. Number 11 is a branch that leads to one of the two kidneys. So there's a kidney there. There's a kidney there. Blood travels into the kidneys to be filtered. And what happens is when the blood is filtered, the good stuff, the water, the glucose, the ions, and the blood cells and stuff stay in the blood, but the wastes are filtered out and will come down some tubes, not blood vessels, down into the urinary bladder where it's stored, and then it's going to be released as urine. So the kidneys filter, and the artery that leads into the kidney is called a renal artery. When the blood comes out of the kidney, it's going to travel not to the aorta, to another structure, but it's going to travel through something called a renal vein. So again, there's these parallel blood vessels. Renal artery carries blood into the kidney. Renal vein carries blood out of the kidney. Let's move along. There are gonads down in this part of the body, whether they're testes or ovaries. This is one of the gonadal arteries. And as we come down here, as it's around the pelvic region here, the aorta is going to split into an iliac artery on the left and on the right. Blood is going to continue traveling down here. Number 14 is called the external iliac artery because there's an internal iliac and an external iliac. There's often internal and exterior of the various blood vessels, so don't worry too much about that. And then as the blood vessel goes down into your leg, you have the bone there called the femur. Well, this is called the femoral artery. Okay, so those are some of the major ones. And then the heart itself, we often think the heart provides blood to all the rest of the body, but the heart is a muscle, it's got living cells, it needs blood itself, and so you can't see these very well, but you could easily find pictures. There are blood vessels on the heart and into the heart, which are the coronary blood vessels, and these are ones that are problematic with things like heart attacks. When these blood vessels get blocked by fat or plaque, someone can have a heart attack because the heart itself is not getting oxygen and nutrients. So coronary arteries provide oxygen and nutrients to the heart muscle itself. Okay, those are some of the major arteries of the body. Another printout that I'm hoping that you have and is available on my website is this one called Blood Vessels, and it's a fill-in-the-blank with a few diagram drawings from the Nelson textbook on these pages. And what I'd like you to do now, once you're completely finished the video and you've got all of those notes, is if you could please work on this, filling in the blanks as you go along and learning a little bit more about blood vessels. All right, so hope that helped you understand blood vessels. See you next time.